I'll be the first to admit that I've gone through several iterations of various theological concepts throughout my life. For instance, I used to be a staunch determinist, as it turns out. And now I really don't hold to determinism. I hold to a more free will conception of Christianity. Another of those theological concepts that has actually evolved very recently for me has been the idea of faith. When I went through Bible college, my conception of faith was I really just didn't know what it was. I read several books trying to understand faith. I tried to see faith in the Bible. I tried to glean from my professors what faith could be, but I really didn't have a good understanding of it. It was really kind of a mystery to me. What my Bible college experience did give me, however, was it gave me access to the writings and to the audio resources of the contemporary preacher John Piper. And through him, I discovered a conception of faith that I really liked, that I really thought was convincing at the time. And that conception of faith was essentially that faith is a type of spiritual sight that is given to you by God. Essentially, God opens your eyes to let you see spiritual reality or the spiritual world or just reality itself in the way that it was meant to be seen, in the way that God intends you to see it. I really enjoyed this conception of faith when I first heard it because what it seemed to offer was a good justification for certain metaphors or certain themes we see in the Bible of God giving people sight or giving sight to the blind or raising the dead. This conception of faith as being some kind of spiritual sight seemed to have a very beautiful tie-in with some of the scriptural instances we see of faith. For instance, we have a conversation between the disciples and Jesus in which Jesus says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." And I think it was Peter, I could be wrong, but one of the disciples, or maybe all of the disciples, confuse this statement from Jesus as Jesus talking about actual bread and actual yeast or leaven that would go into baking bread. And really what Jesus was talking about was he was talking about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. And Jesus' response to their confusion is, "You have little faith. You think I talk about actual bread or actual food, but really I'm talking about something deeper than that, something on a spiritual level." And reading things like that, I thought John Piper's description of faith was really apt. I thought it was really beautiful the way it would tie in, because essentially what Jesus is saying is, you're not seeing with your spiritual eyes. You're not perceiving things the way you ought to be perceiving them. So you have little faith. Your eyes are not quite wide open enough to see what I'm showing you. This seemed to me to be a very eloquent or very beautiful conception of faith that I thought worked well with a lot of the things in the Bible that we see regarding faith, a lot of the verses and the discussions we see in the Bible regarding faith. I thought this conception fit very well. The more that I thought about this conception of faith that Piper offered, however, the more I started to realize that it could be potentially problematic. You see, because Piper's conception is that it's a spiritual sight that is given to you by God. God opens your eyes, so to speak. The reason I started to find this problematic, namely Piper's conception of faith, the reason why I started to find his conception of faith problematic was because I started to think about the portion of his definition where it says that God gives us the faith, that it is God alone who gives us the faith. In a certain respect, that makes sense to me, right? If you think about it as being God opening the eyes of the blind or even raising the dead so that they can now see once again, it seems to make sense that God would be the only one who could bring about the miracle of opening one's eyes or bring about the miracle of raising someone from the dead so that they can see anew. That seems to make sense. But when I started to think about that portion of Piper's definition, I couldn't help but wonder, well, if God brings the grace, for by grace you are saved through faith, if God brings the grace and God also brings the faith, then where in that scheme is there room for human free will? Because like I said, I used to be a determinist, so that wouldn't have been a problem for me at that point in my life. But now I do believe that free will is a crucial ingredient to the gospel and to salvation, because I think that's the only way that people could be culpable or people could be responsible for their choice of whether to reject or to accept Jesus. If it's already predetermined by God that he's going to give faith to some and not give faith to others, then it doesn't seem fair to me that God would punish people for not having faith, because that was his choice ultimately in that understanding. And so that's what I started to see problematic about Piper's conception of faith was, if God gives the faith or God withholds the faith, where is human culpability? Where is human responsibility in that? And I just couldn't see where human responsibility could be in that conception of faith. And so finding this beautiful conception of faith that I had liked so much in the beginning, finding it flawed in my mind was kind of a disappointment. But it really pushed me to start thinking of faith as something that is brought about or wrought of one's own self, of one's own will. Because I couldn't see any other way out of the problem of free will, in that schema. If God gives faith, where is the free will? So I did start to think of faith as something that is produced within oneself, that someone can produce by doing faith-building exercises such as praying or reading the scriptures or interacting with fellow Christians, that somehow faith was built in one's own self. And I guess I kind of roughly held that conception of faith until just very recently, actually, when I had a conversation with one of my commenters. Actually, it was a commenter on one of my videos, ironically enough. The conversation ended cordially, and I don't think it really ended with either one of us being convinced of the other's views. But if anything, it helped me to think through kind of my conception of faith once again, and to think through some of these problems. Just today, I was thinking about it, and I thought, well, why couldn't free will be put into that scheme of faith being God opening people's eyes, God bringing about a miracle of the blind seeing? Why couldn't that be compatible with free will? And I conceptualized it something like this. If God gives every person a measure of faith, if God gives everybody the ability to at least perceive God in some way at some point in their life, then he could allow each individual to do what they will with that nugget of faith, if you will. I believe it's in the book of Romans that it says that everyone knows of God or knows God, but some choose to blind themselves of this knowledge, or some choose to cover their own eyes so that they cannot see the splendor and the evidence of God being real. And I think, this new way of looking at faith that I just kind of was thinking about today, I think that fits very well with that verse. I think it could very well be that God, at some point in everyone's life, gives them a measure of faith so that they are able to see God, or see something of God, see something of existence the way it is meant to be seen, or the way that God intends for it to be seen. And God then gives everyone the choice of what they're going to do with that measure of faith. They choose whether they're going to pursue that faith, whether they're going to chase after it so that they can see more and more, or whether they're going to just cover their eyes and say, that's not something I want. I don't want that. That's going to be too painful. That's going to be too much of a paradigm shift for my life. So I found this very comforting, that there could possibly be a way to mesh these two views of faith, that faith is an act of God, essentially, or a miracle of God in which he opens your eyes to see something of spiritual reality, or to see something of himself, but that it is also compatible with free will, in that God then gives us the choice of what to do with this brief moment of vision, or this brief moment of sight, this small measure of faith. I think that conception of faith would mesh fairly well with most of the scriptures on faith. Obviously, I like I said, this has been an evolving idea for me over the last few days, and so I haven't obviously robustly tested it. But I would be very interested to hear what some of your thoughts are, how you understand faith. Comment down below, and I would also appreciate it if you would like this video and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.